Inaros, formerly known as the worst Warframe, was challenged only by Grendel, Nyx, and Yareli. Per usual, I need to reiterate that every frame in this game is capable of performing at any level if you put the effort in with varying degrees of efficiency. These videos only contain my perspective and design critique. These aren't necessarily intended to be universal gripes. The weirdest thing about Inaros is that I find he has just as many redundancies as Ember, yet people will absolutely rave about Ember's rework. Way too many of Inaros' abilities are trying to CC and or heal. We get to start with the passive. First off is Undying, which again, I'm kind of tilted that so many tanks except the literal Valkyrie Berserker theme get to passively resist death. But I'll keep that gun for when we make it further down the Warframe list. Inaros' Undying allows Inaros to enter Sarcophagus in the bleed out state, during which he can release a true damage beam to siphon health to refill his revive meter. It sadly isn't really practical to use, nor does it scale well. The idea is in the right vein, but lacking overall. Inaros' second passive restores 20% of Inaros' maximum health after a melee finisher kill. I find it has a fair bit of shortcomings, and personally when I concept a frame, I like everything, or most things at the very least, to be cohesive and cooperative. Desiccation is really the only tie to this passive. Not to mention, it relies on killing with the finisher, which with covert lethality dead, it can be difficult to even guarantee the heal without specific weapons or setup. There's a bit of leeway as you could force mercy kills, but this is just another passive that I feel can put you in conflict with your teammates. But we'll stick a pin in that as there's a lot of other pieces that can be rearranged from other abilities. Desiccation is pretty solid as a first ability. It allows Inaros to blind enemies, deal true damage, and heal for 25% of that damage over time. Many people would crucify me if I suggested changes to this ability, but I'll put myself out there as the more I think about it, the more I dislike aspects of this ability. The true damage is mediocre, and because of the first point, that means the healing is rather mediocre as well. Even if the healing wasn't mediocre, your teammates could just murder the enemies before you've gotten much benefit. For the augment, Desiccation's Cursed, it gives Inaros a flat 75% chance to summon a Sand Shadow after a finisher kill. This is lackluster due to the Sand Shadows by definition having no impact. But we'll get into that detail when we talk about Inaros' second ability, Devour. This is where our problems continue as while it makes Inaros invulnerable, it pulls a single target and channels over a long period of time to drain health from that target to heal Inaros. If the target dies, Devour will create a Sand Shadow based on a duration Inaros has to devour. Now, let's get ready for America and Canada's hit game show, Wheel of What Do These Functions Actually Mean to the Player, DE? For what intent were they designed? Devour could be summarized as iframe, single target control, true damage over time, healing over time, and shadow produced on kill. Let's start with the iframe. It doesn't start until the target is at your feet, so you might just make yourself a sitting duck. Single target crowd control, I think the juxtaposition speaks for itself, but in case it doesn't, you already have Desiccate. Why would you bother with this animation to CC one enemy? True damage over time? The damage is pretty decent, but several weapons and or subsumed abilities will net you more damage overall. Healing over time? Devour heals for a flat 400 health per second. Even if we were to ignore the healing from finisher kills in the passive, Magus Repair heals for 25% of HP per second, Life Strike 20% of damage on heavy attack. I think you see where I'm going where this is a poor source of healing. Sand Shadows on kill? It's like watching a nested drop-down menu as here we take a look at what it means to have a Sand Shadow. Sharing of aggro, maximum 3 spawns. I think that's all. This is one of my biggest gripes with some Warframe design. Why are you making a non-unique unit for a Warframe? These Sand Shadows shouldn't just exist. They should have a specific and or unique purpose. These things are like glorified specters. I said it with Korra when it came to Venari, but if these units are a part of Inaros' kit, then they should interact with it. SANDSTORM, Inaros' third ability. I'm really gonna put it on a shirt, DE. It's a line I've had to say for far too many frames. SANDSTORM, you are guilty of removing core mechanics without sufficient trade-off. Not to mention the augment elemental Sandstorm is quite literally worse than any other status application method. Just melee them. Shoot them. Anything else. There is no point trying to bother flailing enemies around with Sandstorm to apply statuses when you could apply statuses and also obliterate them with a weapon. For SCARAB Swarm, Inaros sacrifices health to generate an armor buff. Inaros can spend 25% of this armor buff to throw a SCARAB Swarm debuff on enemies that applies corrosive damage and heals allies, including Inaros. This debuff can spread to unaffected enemies. While the functionality of this ability is overall good, it's got to be one of the clunkiest things to use as a player. You stand there to get protection not even close to what Rhino or Valkyr provide at the press of a button, and then you have to spend that protection to apply corrosive damage over time and pray that a portion of that damage done heals you or your allies. The augment, Negation Swarm, removes a percentage of Inaros' armor buff to prevent status effects. No real qualms here. Now that the critique is out of the way, let's start refining and reallocating these definitions. Please remember, or if you're new here, when I make concepts, my only goal is to get something that would be a good basis to playtest. Something may be a little overtuned in concept, but I feel great about the pieces here. Let's talk about the new passives. SCARAB Armor. Inaros uses health to cast abilities. Whenever Inaros' health is lost, it conveys a stacking armor buff. I'm not going to bother with specifying an exact conversion formula since there are so many ways to implement it, but the general idea should hold. As for Undying, this is a team game. Why not allow avenues of teamwork to shine? They could rework it so that Inaros can cast a harmless version of Desiccate so that allies can aid by killing affected enemies, or, better yet, just give Undying a radius indicator and allow allies to stand within range to assist in revival through damage or kills. If anything, that should be better thematically as it lines up more with the themes of servants paying tribute to a pharaoh. I'm not going to specify it for each ability, but I imagine most, if not all of Inaros' abilities dealing true damage based on his maximum HP in some way. Even if it's a small amount, it'll feel better as a player to have most of his scaling focused on his maximum HP, something we can control. For the new Desiccation, I'd instead prefer Inaros to get a health regen buff based on a percentage of his maximum HP per enemy hit. Desiccate, however, would not be able to be reapplied to the same enemy until its effect ended. This should reduce some of the team conflict and reward Inaros for a stat he can control instead of siphoning enemies over time. For the new Desiccation's Curse Augment, Inaros gains stacking damage for the next melee attack based on his maximum HP per enemy hit. Essentially, think of it the way the energy channel mod works, except instead of storing the energy you spend, it's stockpiling based on the maximum numbers you hit until your next attack. Hitting allies with Desiccate would instead convey the bonus damage to their next melee attack without resetting it for Inaros. So again, I'm giving Inaros tools to scale, but more importantly, enforcing his status as a delegator. It's not ideal, but I do think it might be fine to add a decaying mechanic to encourage more pocket sand madness instead of stacking to infinity, per se. For the new Devour, Inaros drains health over time from enemies in range to heal allies, including Inaros. If no enemies are in range, it instead drains health from Inaros over time. When enemies die in range of Devour, it restores a percentage of health and increases Inaros' maximum HP. When the enemy falls to a finisher or mercy kill, these effects are doubled. Any excess healing is instead applied as a protective coating that offers brief invulnerability when depleted. As for the Sand Shadows, I don't really feel they're needed since I've abstracted their role to the Force ability in a different way, but I wanted to note that there's still a valid design where the Sand Shadows are the second ability and Devour is designed as a passive. However, I do want to note that the key to Sand Shadows being valid is their interaction with Inaros' kit. To specify, imagine the Sand Shadows had a specific design, like let's say something like Sand Kuva Guardian, or even Pharaoh Predicites. Examples of kit interactions would be, their damage is always considered finisher damage. Duplicating Desiccate in an area around them when Inaros casts Desiccate. They could even play into the revised Undying passive, say, when Inaros goes into bleed out state, they teleport to his location and assist in the revival, even if it's just mindlessly attacking enemies and filling up the revival bar. For the new Sandstorm, Inaros can deploy 1 to 3 medium-range sandstorm areas that slow enemies, reduce their accuracy, and apply damage vulnerability at an increasing rate over time. This sandstorm would also have a guaranteed impact status per tick. If Inaros is within the sandstorm area, his casting and finisher speed are doubled. Desiccate would also apply to all enemies within Sandstorm's radius, and equally Devour's range would be doubled. For the new Elemental Sandstorm, I'm fine with the overall effect, but they should hike the base status to 150 or 200% so that it's competitive with weapons. For the new SCARAB Swarm, as much as I love the idea of Sand Shadows done correctly, I was thinking of ways to abstract their role and focusing Inaros on being a sand tank, or more importantly, a sentinel for the team. Sure, I could have just made Sand Shadows with shields, but making Scarab Sentinels made my brain so much happier. I'm fine if the ability is still a chargeable ability, but I'm still iffy on the whole standing still mechanic. But in this case, I feel fine as Inaros would sacrifice his health to summon Scarab Sentinels that absorb damage for allies in affinity range up to his max HP and armor value. The Scarab Sentinels felt like a good way to abstract Inaros drawing aggro for the whole team. The Scarab Sentinels have slow-firing melee Parazon spines and automatically add to Inaros' maximum health if they get a kill. This kill would be considered a finisher and apply Parazon mods. Okay, it's kinda iffy on applying the Parazon mods, but I think it'd be cool. You might be asking if this is an Exalted Sentinel, and if you've seen any of my other videos, the easy answer is there's no need. The only functionalities the Sentinel need are Sacrifice and debatably Regen, not to mention an internal precept to focus Parazon targets. While the Scarabs are active, all of Inaros' abilities will apply Corrosive status in addition to their other status. Not to mention, Desiccation's health regen buff will be applied to all allies with Sentinel. It should be noted that Scarab Sentinels are not healed from regen, but instead are healed slowly over time while in Sandstorm's radius. Equally, while within Sandstorm's radius, Scarab Sentinels would gain an increased rate of fire and targeting radius. If a finisher is performed by a player with a Scarab Sentinel, the Scarab will release a curse debuff in a radius. This curse would apply the finisher damage done as a bleed to affected enemies. Alternatively, the curse could apply a percentage of the Scarab's health as a bleed. But that's effectively the foundation that came to mind for my rework concept. It should be solid enough to be tweaked and adjusted, say if there needed to be caps applied or what have you. Thank you all for taking the time to listen. Hopefully my design didn't get too out of sand. Let me know what you think of my critique or ideas, and if you have any Inaros dreams or gripes yourself.